Thank you. Yeah. Okay, great. So welcome to this week's Water, Climate, and Environment seminar. We have another PhD talk. And so with all PhD talks, we administer an evaluation form, which you will be receiving in the chat window. And so feel free to submit it, whether you're a student or faculty or a scientist here. All input is really valuable to the speaker. And so this is, again, a PhD talk, and to introduce Justin Thompson will be his advisor, Michael Young.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to introduce Justin to the Friday seminar. Justin received his BA in International Business in 2007 from Texas Tech. So he has taken a lot of different roads to get where he is. He spent several years in China, both teaching English and kind of helping to facilitate business between the U.S. and in China. He got a double master's in global policy studies from the LBJ School and a master's in energy and earth resources, both in 2018, and has been a PhD student in the Jackson School since that fall, since fall of 2018. And so his work is really focusing on groundwater recoverability, which he will describe, and a variety of different aspects on it. So Justin, I will stop here and let you take it away.
All right, roger that. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. So my name is Justin Thompson. I'm going to talk to you today about exploring groundwater recoverability in Texas. I'd like to take a moment to thank my committee, Dr. Michael Young, Sheila Olmsted, Daniela Rempe, and Jay Banner. So let's get started. If I can. There we go. All right. So how much of stored groundwater in Texas is recoverable? That's sort of the theme of today's talk. So first, let's talk about some big picture questions. Well, what is groundwater recoverability? It's generally defined as the relative ease or difficulty of human extraction. It's one key element of groundwater availability and yields. It's generally constrained by the aquifer, the well, and economics. So our key questions that we're going to explore today, that I explore with my dissertation, are: how could recoverability be quantified and simulated? How do aquifer storage conditions impact recoverability? And how might changes in recoverability impact Texas's most sensitive users? So first, let's talk about motivation. Why does this study matter? Many of us are familiar with the most recent 2017 State Water Plan, Water for Texas. It projects water deficits of 8.9 million acre feet by 2070 under drought of record conditions. Those deficits are projected concurrent with both a 70% increase in population by 2070 and an 11% decline in total water supplies. Now, what's interesting about that 11% decline is that if you do a little bit of math that the plan doesn't do for you, you find that 95% of that 11% decline is from groundwater availability changes. So here on the bottom, we see this chart that's sort of well known and well used at this point, projecting those deficits. And here on the right, we have annual groundwater availability, all right, and existing supply in acre feet. Here at the top, first a quick note: availability versus existing supply. Existing supply is a subset of availability, and it basically tells you how much of that water is connected to existing water user groups. So what I want you to take away from this chart is to see that the Ogallala is far and away #1 in terms of availability, followed by the Gulf Coast, followed by the Carrizo-Wilcox, and then the rest of the state's aquifers sort of drop off fairly randomly from, fairly extensively from there. And we'll kind of come back to this and see why this is interesting in a moment. So next, I want to give you a quick crash course on groundwater management in Texas, what I like to call the alphabet soup. We're almost as bad as the military with our acronyms, but I'll try to keep it straight for you. So first, we have groundwater conservation districts, or GCDs. These are the primary Texas groundwater regulatory entities. They're the ones responsible for permitting groundwater withdrawals in Texas. Then we have groundwater management areas, or GMAs. Now, GMAs are composed of groups of GCDs, generally within a common major aquifer footprint. Then we have what are called desired future conditions, or DFCs. And these are essentially a set of metrics that tell us what do we want our aquifer to look like over time? There's quite a few forms of them, but most commonly they are a depth to water change over time. There's also some versions out there such as saturated thickness metrics or spring flow metrics, but far and away most common is a depth to water change. Then we have the Texas Water Development Board. They develop their groundwater availability models to simulate how an aquifer performs. And then they create what is called modeled available groundwater, or a MAG. So GCDs, generally speaking, permit pumping pursuant to the desired future conditions that they set. And in that sense, groundwater availability in Texas is effectively equivalent to the modeled available groundwater, right? So here on the right, I know that's just alphabet soup and kind of confusing. So here on the right, we've kind of got that pictured. So you've got a collection of groundwater conservation districts within a GMA who together come together and elect, the proper term is adopt a desired future condition, right? So such as, for example, our DFC is 25 feet of drawdown over 50 years. And they send that to the board, and the board puts that DFC together with the groundwater availability model to create that modeled available groundwater number, that volume. So for example, your DFC is 25 feet of drawdown over 50 years. Okay, then you have 100,000 acre feet to allocate annually. And that's pretty much how the system of groundwater management in Texas works. But what goes into those desired future conditions? Well, the Texas Water Code, Chapter 36, Section 108D, actually lists them out for us. Everything from the feasibility of actually achieving that desired future condition to what kind of uses or conditions are going on with the aquifer, water supply needs and management strategies, to environmental impacts, right? Like spring flows, as we have here pictured on the right. Subsidence is another important issue, particularly along the Gulf Coast. How much change in land surface subsidence is a community willing to accept for groundwater production? And then there's a few key pieces, considerations that we're particularly interested in here. Socioeconomic impacts, interest and rights in private property, and hydrological conditions. And hydrological conditions include things like recharge and discharge into and out of the aquifer, and also this term called total estimated recoverable storage, which is an interesting term, and we want to look at this a little bit more closely. So first, let's look at the key component of total estimated recoverable storage, the term total storage. It's actually defined by the Texas Water Code, Chapter 36, as the total volume an aquifer is capable of producing. So if you drained an aquifer completely, how much water would be produced? And it's actually a fairly large number. Across all of the major aquifers in Texas, it's about 11.5 billion acre feet. And as you can see in this pie chart here, the vast majority of that stored groundwater actually occurs in the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, which is here in red and then depicted kind of cutting across the state here. And then the Gulf Coast Aquifer in the light yellow, which is appropriately named along the Gulf Coast. For clarity, the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer stores 5.2 billion acre feet. And I should make a quick note, I will use English units throughout this presentation. I apologize for that, but that is the unit system that we use for groundwater management in Texas. And obviously we want our analysis and results to fold neatly therein too. So English units, apologies for those who aren't used to it. Our papers give you metric unit equivalents. Anyway, so the Carrizo-Wilcox 5.2 billion acre feet, it's about 45% of the total groundwater stored in Texas. And that's kind of a lot of water. It's actually about 53% of the volume stored in Lake Superior, which is the third largest lake storage in the world. And again, the Gulf Coast makes up another significant portion there. Here on the right, you can just see the major aquifers sort of color-coded. The numbers are the groundwater management areas, and then the gray shading is where we have groundwater conservation districts. Note that there are no data available for the Waco-Mesilla-Bolson's aquifer because there are no groundwater conservation districts there, so the board doesn't calculate those numbers. So now, okay, we've kind of looked at what total storage is, right? Well, what about total estimated recoverable storage? Well, it was established in 2011, and it's really Texas's best estimate of groundwater recoverability. It's two numbers. It's 25% and 75% of total storage. right? And these numbers indicate that there are potentially billions of acre feet recoverable, right? The Carrizo-Wilcox, for example, at the 25% metric would suggest that there are 1.3 billion acre feet recoverable. So here on the right, I've pictured from the TWDB TERS reports kind of a visualization of how that total storage and TERS calculation work. Recall that total storage is everything it's capable of producing. So if you drain an aquifer completely, and there's kind of two different versions of that. So on the left, we have an unconfined aquifer. And in that case, all of the water that's produced is coming from the pore space storage within the aquifer, the saturated thickness itself. On the right, in a confined setting, you have not only that pore space storage, but also the water produced from reducing the pressure in the aquifer, right? So the expansion of the water in the aquifer materials itself. So we have a calculation here to come up with that yield number, and it's really just the area, the land surface area that one is interested in, right, multiplied by the head change. If you're looking at total storage, so that would be from what it is today all the way to the bottom of the aquifer, times the relevant storage coefficient. Right, and I want to note that there's a really big difference in these storage coefficients between an unconfined setting and a confined setting. Right, as an example, specific yield in an unconfined setting might be 0.15, and storativity in the confined setting might be 0.0003. Right, and we'll see why this is important. Just kind of want you to keep it in mind. Anyhow, these very large, potentially recoverable volumes indicated by TERS have led some folks to conclude that we are experiencing a regulation-induced shortage in Texas. Well, I'm not so sure about that. First, I want to say that TERS at 25% and 75% are purely arbitrary limits. There's no accounting of desired future condition considerations that we just talked about, nor pumping dynamics, nor economic feasibility. We actually were just having a dialogue with Robert Mace recently, who talked about why that is, and essentially it came down to the fact that when TERS was created, it was an unfunded mandate, and looking at all of these things together was simply too much for the board to be able to handle with the bandwidth they had available. So recalling that groundwater availability chart from the state water plan, again, Ogallala is the far and away the largest availability in the state. But we just saw a moment ago in total storage that it only stores a total of 308 million acre feet compared to the Carrizo-Wilcox down here, which is over 5 billion acre feet. So what's going on here? Well, this suggests that these issues over here, which aren't considered by TERS, are in fact restraining or constraining in many cases. And we're going to look at some of that. So our approach, how can we quantify groundwater recoverability? More than just arbitrary limits, right? We consider two issues. First, physical constraints, where we look at the aquifer and the well's capacity versus your pumping demand, right? So what is the physical feasibility of the aquifer and well to meet your pumping demand? And then we also look at some economic constraints, your willingness to pay for the water you're pumping against the cost of what it takes you to produce that water. And putting all those together, we can come up with 3 limits to recoverability. The first one, a physical limit, is whatever your depth to water, your H, your head is, plus your drawdown under pumping equals the top of your well screen, right? And that's kind of pictured right here. It is possible to have this point exceed the top of your well screen, but we call that over pumping. And it first of all, it has efficiency issues and some economic issues, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The second limit is where pumping costs equal your willingness to pay, right? You say what your maximum willingness to pay is, and if your pumping costs equal that, well, then it's no longer economically efficient or possible for you to pump beyond that. And then we have a third limit right here, which is sort of user defined, right? And that could be, for example, those desired future conditions that we talked about. All right, so we kind of just got all that pictured here. This is what your water level might be today, and you'll notice your pumping drawdown, just a little bit here, and this is what your maximum head limit might be under a physical constraint. And you see that the pumping drawdown is a bit more significant here. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so we can kind of parcel off the aquifer here into 3 separate parts, right? You've got your dead pool, which is essentially reserved for your well screen interval. And then you've got your pumping range, which is reserved to support your pumping drawdown. And then you've got your production range. And this is essentially what is feasible to produce under these limits. Now we're going to look at these in just a little bit more detail, these constraints. First, the physical constraints. So I hate that I have to say this, but aquifers are not bottomless. I know it sounds crazy and self-evident, but I'm personally very surprised at the number of occurrences in the literature, particularly in groundwater economics literature, which simply assume a bottomless aquifer of infinite areal extent. That's kind of the common quote. But well, that's not really the case, and we can put a bottom on our aquifer to see how that impacts recoverability. First, we look at the aquifer and well capacity to meet demand, right? And in the course of our dissertation, we looked at two different methods for this. First, we looked at specific capacity, which is a very widely reported and fairly easy to understand term. One form of it tells you, how much water is produced per foot of drawdown. And you can use this specific capacity to estimate the aquifer and well's ability to meet demand based on this equation right here, which is fairly easy to do with just a piece of paper and a calculator. And you'll see I've highlighted these T's here, and I'll come back to why that is in just a moment. The second method that we used for assessing an aquifer capacity to meet demand is calculating drawdown, right? Calculating what this curve looks like, specifically what it looks like right here, just 1 foot away from the well screen, right, to simulate the outer gravel pack. And one example of how to do that is using the Tice solution, right? And here we see those T's again. We have a lot of reason to believe that the drawdown calculation method is a bit more precise and accurate than specific capacity. But as you can see, the calculation is more complex. You can't really do it easily with a piece of paper and a calculator anymore. And again, I have these T's highlighted. Well, why do I have these T's highlighted? Well, because T stands for transmissivity. And transmissivity is really just hydraulic conductivity multiplied by saturated thickness. So it declines as your saturated thickness declines. So in an unconfined setting, as the water level decreases over time, the ability of the aquifer and well to meet your demand decreases over time. Now that is in the unconfined setting. In the confined setting, it's actually constant. And this is part of what has led some people to erroneously come to the conclusion that that aquifers in confined settings have an almost limitless ability to meet demand. That's not really true, and we'll see that in a moment. As I mentioned, over pumping, it is possible for this for your water level under pumping, drawdown under pumping to get lower than the top of your well screen, but it creates significant efficiency losses. And we've actually all experienced this when you're drinking your soda or what have you, and you get down toward the bottom and you start hearing that slurping, bubbling noise. It's a lot harder to drink your soda then than it is, when the cup is mostly full. Also, importantly, over pumping may significantly damage the well and pump. So altogether, we have a physical limit of where H, right, plus your drawdown equals the top of your well screen. That can be your maximum H for a physical limit. Now for economic constraints, well, costs increase with depth in all cases, in all settings, right? We look at pumping costs. Now I'm going to try to keep this straight for you. Pumping costs is the integration of all of these pieces, right? It's got both lifting costs and some fixed costs. Lifting costs are essentially the energy cost that it takes to lift the water, from the level plus your pumping under drawdown to your land surface, right? We can calculate that here. Drilling costs, right? Drilling costs are a function of the depth that you're drilling to, right? They're frequently quoted as some number of dollars per foot, and your diameter of your well, which is directly related to your pumping rate. And then finally, we have some pump equipment costs, the powerhouse for your well, which is again a function of your pumping rate and then the actual distance that you're lifting that water. And so I have this lifting depth and lift where it's highlighted here, because these are all going to increase, right, as you're talking about increased depth. So the limit we have here is where your pumping costs are equivalent to your willingness to pay, right? And importantly, for domestic uses, we actually have a threshold of affordability that's been developed by the EPA for us, which is equivalent to 2.5% of median household income. Now, a quick note about drawdown and optimization. As I mentioned, you saw a minute ago the Tice solution for drawdown, but an important assumption of the Tice solution for drawdown is that the well is fully penetrating, meaning the screen runs the entire saturated thickness of the aquifer. And that might be reasonable, maybe in a confined setting, but it certainly isn't a reasonable assumption in the unconfined setting if you're trying to avoid overpumping. Right? So what we want to do is we want to use the Hantu solution for partial screen penetration drawdown. And this is really important. As you see down here, there's a very significant difference between partial penetration and partial penetration up here and full penetration drawdown. And in many cases, depending on the pumping rate and the aquifer parameters, the additional drawdown caused by partial well screen penetration can be 2 to 3 times what one would expect from a full penetration drawdown. It also, obviously, it's a much more complex solution and it introduces a few terms. We've still got our T here, which, as we said, decreases as we talk about increasing depth to water in an unconfined setting. And then we've got B, L, and D, right? B being your saturated thickness, right? Which again will decrease it with depth to water in an unconfined setting. L being your the sort of total penetration depth of the well, and then D being sort of the difference between the water level and the top of the well screen. So putting all these things together gives us actually the opportunity to do some really cool optimization solutions where we can maximize our yield against drawdown, costs, willingness to pay, and maximize yield against these partial penetration effects. Am I back? I think I'm back. Okay. Anyway, so how do we go about doing all this? Well, we built a numerical model, right? And instead of just showing you pictures of a bunch of pretty Python code, I thought I'd do my best to kind of visualize it here for you. So the model accepts a number of inputs, right? So first we have some user values. So your demand, your pumping period, your willingness to pay, your power costs, right, et cetera. And this is valuable because you can tailor these inputs to a whole range of uses and local conditions, right? We got some well values, well efficiency, well screen open area, et cetera. And then finally, you've got your aquifer conditions, those storage coefficients we talked about, and the various depths, right? What's the land surface elevation, aquifer thickness, hydraulic conductivity, right? So the model pulls in all of these values and calculates quite a lot of things. As we said, we look at dynamic transmissivity changing with depth to water, and the model calculates all these changes with 1 foot water level depth change increments. It calculates your pumping rate, artesian flow if that's necessary, right? And how that changes your pumping rate, well losses to your drawdown and lifting distance. And so here we've got that drawdown calculation, and I showed the little arrows going back and forth here with the optimal screen calculation because the model goes through quite a lot of logic and repetitions to, like I said, optimize for yield. With all that together, we can come up with your pumping costs, which gives us, we can give you that at all possible depths to water in a 1 foot increment. And then with that, we can tell you what your limits might be, right, that we just talked about, your economic depth limit, your physical capacity depth limit, and that user depth limit, whatever you might put in there, for example, a DFC. And using that total storage calculation we looked at earlier, instead of looking at draining the aquifer completely, we can look at simply draining it to these limits to calculate yields. So now let's look at our study area that we use to develop and test this model. We're looking specifically at the central Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer. As we said, the Carrizo has quite a lot, 50, I think it was 52% of the, total storage of all major aquifers in the state, over 5 billion acre feet, right? And it's in close proximity to sort of a number of burgeoning development corridors. Here you can see the stratigraphy that I pulled from the groundwater availability model report in 2003, and it shows you what the stratigraphy looks like from southwest to central to northeast. And I've taken the liberty of dropping in some blue shading here to show you the water-bearing units. The Sparta sand and the Queen City sand are minor aquifers for the state of Texas. And then the Carrizo, Calvert Bluff, Simsboro, and Hooper formations collectively together are the quote-unquote Carrizo-Wilcox aquifer. Here, I just want to note the solid red indicates the outcrop area where the formations are at land surface, and then the hatching indicates where it's at subcropped, right? So there are other formations overlying it. And I've highlighted here in the orange the central Carrizo-Wilcox, which is what we're looking at in this study. Here, just to give you an idea of the vertical dip orientation, we've got a transect here from A to A prime right through Aggie country. And this is important, right? Because it shows you here in the northwestern parts of the aquifer where the formations are outcrop at land surface, you'll find the aquifer is in unconfined conditions. Whereas toward the southeastern extent, such as Brazos County or Grimes County, you've got quite a few formations overlying it, and you're going to see the aquifer occur in confined conditions. And again, that's we're going to see why that's really important here in a moment. So here's what the footprint of the central Carrizo-Wilcox groundwater availability model looks like. It's quite large. These cells are per the standard of the groundwater availability models at a 1 square mile resolution. And so for the central Carrizo-Wilcox, that equates to 26,009 active cells. So as we'll talk about maybe a little bit more in a minute, to run full analyses of this whole aquifer footprint requires advanced computing, which we're actually working on right now. Here we've got a digital elevation model for the study area, which I resampled from the 1 square mile resolution from the National Elevation Dataset, and which comes in at a 10 square meter resolution. Here on the left, so we've got those 4 formations, but for brevity's sake, in a few places, I'm just going to show you the Hooper formation because we don't really have time to show you all 4 formations and all of these different parameters. So that's what we see here is the Hooper formation. This is actually the thickness of the aquifer, and you can see it ranges quite a bit from about maybe 50 feet here where it sort of pinches out at the outcrop to almost 2,000 feet in some sections. Here on the right, this is kind of showing you that dip depth that we were talking about just a moment ago. This is the depth of the bottom of the aquifer, right? So it's as much, and this is in feet above mean sea level, right? So here on the northwestern areas, we see it's maybe 500, almost 600 feet above mean sea level. Down here in the southeastern parts, it's as much as over 12,000 feet below sea level. So we're talking about quite significant depth here in some places. Here on the left, we've got Hooper formation, vertical hydraulic conductivity in feet per day, which is quite spatially variable. Also, the Hooper formation has one of the lower hydraulic conductivities among formations in the Carrizo-Wilcox. We'll see that in a moment. And so it ranges quite a bit from over 5 feet per day to about 1.5 feet per day. On the right, we've got the Hooper formation depth to water. Now this is in feet. This is in feet from land surface. It's depth, right? And so what we see here is in some places and this is 2010 water levels, which is the most recent water levels we have available through the TWDB groundwater modeling. And it ranges from almost 500 feet below land surface to a negative number, right, where we actually have theoretically artesian flows where the head is actually well above land surface by as much as 200 feet. And then finally, we have some socioeconomic parameters that we can and are looking at. On the left, pursuant to that EPA limit on what is considered affordable for domestic users, we have median household income in dollars per year. And this comes to us from the 2018 American Community Survey data. And you can see that's ranges quite a bit, as you might expect. And again, the polygons here are census tracts, which they range in size quite a bit. They're usually linked to mostly to population. So when you see clusters of smaller census tracts, that means more people live there, and larger census tracts mean less people live there. And so here again, we see median household income ranges quite a bit from a little less than $25,000 per year all the way up to over $133,000 per year. Then on the right, we've got some agricultural data, right? From this is the cropland data layer processed from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, showing us 2019 values. And as you can see from the legend, with such a large footprint, we have quite a few agricultural activities going on here. But here along the Brazos River, you can see there's a significant cluster of predominantly corn and cotton. So now let's look at our model results and see what our analysis is telling us. Again, as I said, we're working on that high performance computing for the entire aquifer footprint right now. But for today, I'm going to show you just sort of a representative section of the Central Carrizo-Wilcox, that being the Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District, which in the north is composed of Milam County and the south is Burleson County. For all of the model runs that you're about to see, the cost of power was given as 10 cents per kilowatt hour, pretty standard. The desired future condition this is the real actual desired future condition adopted by the Post Oak Savannah GCD is plus 65 feet of drawdown over 50 years. Well efficiency is assumed at a sort of middling 75%. Same thing for well screen open area, about 10%. And then here's what I was mentioning earlier, where we do see the range of hydraulic conductivity among these formations. I mentioned Hooper was sort of along the lower end. For this area, it ranges from a little over 2 to almost 4 feet per day, whereas the Simsboro formation, by comparison, over 12 to nearly 30 feet per day. And here are the specific yield numbers that are assumed throughout the entire aquifer extent by the board, me, and everybody else. And you can see they're either 0.1 or 0.15. Now, I want you to keep in mind as we look at these results, this solid red area here. So this is that outcrop part of these formations within the GCD. And just kind of keep that shape in mind as we look at these results here in a moment. So first, let's start with that total storage we were talking about. How much water can an aquifer physically produce if it's drained completely? So here on the left, here's the Hooper Formation, Simsboro Formation, Calvert Bluff, and Carrizo, right? And you can kind of see that layering as Hooper has the largest extent, and then Simsboro, and then Calvert Bluff, and then Carrizo, right? So they kind of layer up in that dip angle you saw a moment ago. Just within this GCD, Hooper Formation has nearly 59 million acre feet of storage, right? Kind of similar for the Simsboro. Calvert Bluff is the largest at 63.75 million acre feet. And then the Carrizo Formation is the smallest in this area. So we have a total gross GCD storage throughout all four of these formations of nearly 208 million acre feet. A fair amount of water. Oh, and just, yeah, you can see the legends here showing you how that storage changes, right? Again, as you see the unconfined section, right, where it's getting narrow, the formation thickness is smaller and smaller, you get smaller storage. And then down here in the southeastern parts of the aquifer, where you've got both the saturated thickness and the confined pressure storage, it's significantly higher numbers. So now let's look at the yield at the demand capacity constraint, right? How much the aquifer is physically capable of producing under your pumping rate and the limitations of the well and the aquifer altogether. Here we see these white cells. These white cells indicate that the conditions present in the aquifer are actually insufficient to support your pumping rate, right? Without introducing over pumping. Here we see Hooper Formation, about a little over 43.5 million acre feet. Simsboro, kind of comparable. Calvert Bluff, Carrizo, kind of following the same trend that we saw with the total storage. So again, with the gross area demand capacity yield for all of these together is about 158 million acre feet. That turns out to be about 76% of the total storage. So interestingly, in this case, where the pumping rate is 70 gallons per minute, the physical limitations of the well and aquifer sort of mimic TERS at that total estimated recoverable storage at the 75% benchmark. But that's the physical constraints. Let's look at the economic constraints. There's quite a big difference. So here what we're looking at is just lifting costs. And I want you to keep that in mind. This is just the energy costs, the limit at the economic limit, just based on the energy costs of lifting the water to the land surface. This is assuming that the well was free. So we see the same white cells indicating where it's infeasible to pump at all. But now we see at these limits, at this economic lifting cost limit, the yield is much, much, much smaller, right? In the Hooper Formation, you're looking at only a little over 5% of formation total storage, right? And similar, right? In total, we're looking at a little over 8% of gross total area storage. So that's actually much, much less than what you would see at TERS in 25%. And what's going on here with this band of recoverability, and then out here to the southeast where everything looks pretty small? Well, essentially, because we're just looking at the lifting costs, right? The depth to water at which you're limiting yourself is the same in all of these cells, right? But what's happening is the conditions of the aquifer are different from here to here. Here, where you have a green cell, for example, the depth at which you were limited by your lifting costs is in the unconfined setting. So you're getting all of that pore space production, right? That specific yield number, that 0.1 or 0.15. Down here, the depth that the same depth that you're limited to up here occurs in the confined part of the system. So the production you're getting is from that storativity number, that 0.00003, right? So therefore, the amount of water you're getting over here, pursuant to our yield calculation, is much smaller. And that's what we're seeing here, this big difference between these recoverability zones. And if you'll notice, these lines pretty much mimic that outcrop area that I told you to kind of remember, right? So this is where the aquifer is in unconfined settings. So here, just kind of side by side, in the previous slide, I had, each formation, and here I just wanted to give you the same formation with all three of those, so you could do a quick, easy comparison, right? So total storage, yielded demand capacity constraint, it's not too far off, right, from the total storage. You can get most of the water, 75% of it roughly, at this pumping rate. But over here, again, much smaller. Maybe, I think it was, what did we have for Hooper? Yeah, 5.21% of total storage. So now let's look at how do these yields change if we vary some of these input parameters? So first, let's look at the demand capacity constraint with variable pumping rates. Here in the center is the same demand capacity yield you just saw, right, at 70 gallons per minute pumping. But here on the left, this is the yield at the demand capacity constraint where the pumping rate is only 1 gallon per minute, which might be appropriate for, say, a domestic user. As you can see, there are no cells that are infeasible to pump from. That's because at a 1 gallon per minute pumping rate, your well screen interval is quite small, your drawdown under pumping is quite small, and therefore your production range is well and truly maximized. On the other hand, compare over here to the far right, where we have a pumping rate of 500 gallons per minute, right, as might be appropriate for, say, an irrigator. We see a stark difference. We have a much larger number of cells where it is infeasible to pump from, and the yield for a large part of the aquifer is much smaller than it would be otherwise. And this is, again, this is to reserve the saturated thickness that is, and the head that is required to support the well screen interval, which is going to be much larger to support that pumping rate, and the drawdown under pumping, which is going to be much larger under a larger pumping rate. So now let's look at lifting costs. So again, this is just lifting costs. This is just the energy costs to lift the water to land surface. This is assuming your well was free, right? But let's look at how lifting costs vary with variable depth to water, right? Such as under a desired future condition. So here's lifting costs at the initial starting depth to water of 2010 water levels for the Hooper formation. And this is again at that 500 gallon per minute irrigation rate. And we can see there, they're not nothing, but they're relatively minor for most of the aquifer. We actually do see in a number of places where pumping costs are zero due to that, the lifting costs are zero due to that, the artesian flow. And then here, comparing this one to this one, this is where water levels have been increased by 65 feet pursuant to that desired future condition. So again, fairly recoverable. We do see some moderate increases here where the price has gone up a fair amount. But then compare those two against what the lifting costs are at the demand capacity constraint, right? At the depth where the aquifer and well can no longer meet your demand without over pumping. Here we're talking about an increase in depth to water of up to 7,681 feet. So a very big change in depth. And here we see some pumping costs have gone up from, zero, right, and where we had some artesian flow, all the way up to about $1,000 per acre foot. Now, a quick note on, pumping costs, right, dollars per acre foot. What does that really relate to? Well, here's the thought, right? If you pay $1 for a standard 16.9 fluid ounce bottle of water, that equates to about $2.5 million per acre foot. So we're nowhere near that level, obviously, but that's, maybe not the most reasonable example. We all know that bottled water is, very expensive. As another point of comparison, I understand that the San Antonio water system, with its Vista Ridge pipeline project, which originates right about here and provides water to the people of San Antonio, the contract that SAWS, the San Antonio water systems, executed, has a purchase price of water for about $150 per acre foot. So just some points of comparison for you when we talk about these numbers. So now let's look at an actual domestic affordability, and this is by pumping costs. So this is not lifting costs, this is pumping costs. This is the whole kit and caboodle. This is your energy costs to lift the water to land surface, this is your drilling costs, and this is your pump powerhouse costs. And again, it's in dollars per acre foot. And here again, we're gonna look at it with variable depth to water. Right now, a moment, we mentioned that the EPA has given us a threshold for affordability as 2.5% of median household income. And I showed you a couple slides back what median household income looks like in those census tracts. It varies quite a bit. But for the Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District, median household income translated to that 2.5% as a willingness to pay for water. And again, assuming a certain domestic water use per day, it comes out to a range of between $1,139 per. My headset keeps going dead because no one's talking. I'm sorry. So it ranges from $1,139 per acre foot to $579 per acre foot as a domestic willingness to pay threshold, 2.5% median household income. So here's what it looks like for the Hooper Formation at initial depth to water, right? So here we see in the colors, these are still our pumping costs, right, in dollars per acre foot. And so everything that's unshaded is pumping costs are less than the relevant 2.5% median household income mark. Everything that is shaded the pumping costs exceed whatever this number is on a cell by cell basis. So everything in gray is not affordable for a domestic household use. Here we see the same chart at the desired future conditions, right, of an additional 65 feet of depth over 50 years. And we see that the pumping costs have changed a bit. It's a little bit darker, a little bit hotter colors, not a whole lot. But importantly, we see these pink cells that I've highlighted showing you cells that were previously affordable but are now no longer affordable. And to make the same comparison, this is the same thing, but at the demand capacity constraint. And here we see, again, the colors have gotten significantly hotter. You can see a lot more red and dark oranges down here than over here. And now we have an even larger number of pink cells where domestic groundwater uses are no longer affordable at that demand capacity constraint depth. So in closing, what can we take away from this study? Well, first, groundwater availability. There is no universal solution throughout the state. There's just too many things to think about, right? And we saw those as our desired future conditions considerations. Now, importantly, many of those considerations may be conflicting. Right? So subsidence, right, may be conflicting with your interests and rights in private property or your socioeconomic impacts, or the same thing for environmental impacts, right? Spring flows might be in direct contrast to interests and rights in private property. We saw that total estimated recoverable storage, or TERS, represents arbitrary limits to recoverability. It gives no consideration for pumping dynamics nor economic feasibility. Therefore, it may drastically overestimate groundwater recoverability for certain uses in deep and confined settings. So what is recoverability? Well, it's a key element of groundwater availability. And importantly, the way we've calculated it here, it's directly compatible with depth to water based desired future conditions. We've scientifically quantified it using physical limitations, which are constrained by aquifer and well capacity versus demand, and economic limitations, where costs increased with depth to water in all cases. All users are economically incentivized to minimize depth to water. And here it's constrained by willingness to pay versus pumping costs. And again, so one size does not fit all, right? Your groundwater recoverability results are highly subjective to your use. They're highly subjective to your pumping rate, to your willingness to pay, right? So there is no solution for one size fits all solution for everybody. But we can quantify groundwater recoverability at current conditions or projected conditions for known uses. And that gives us a lot of really valuable information. It can help us evaluate threats and opportunities. And this is an important issue that not just for Texas, but globally. There was actually here on the right, this picture is taken from an article that was published in Science literally today, talking about global groundwater wells at risk of running dry. And one element of that analysis looked at the depth of groundwater wells around the world. And you can see here on the right, this one is actually in metric units, but here on the right, you can see that many of our wells in Texas are quote comparatively deeper than they are in other parts of the nation or indeed the world. And you can even see the nice sort of outline there of the Carrizo-Wilcox, Balcones Fault Zone and Trinity, and even the Ogallala up there in the Panhandle. I'd like to just take a moment to put some acknowledgments out there to those who have supported my work. We've got the State of Texas Advanced Oil and Gas Resource Recovery, or STAR program, Planet Texas 2050, the Bureau of Economic Geology, and the BEG Excellence Fund for Water Research and Policy, and most recently, the Texas Water Resources Institute. And with that, I think I am right at 45 minutes. So thank you very much for attending, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin. Let me ask a really quick question. Can you just define, can you define what willingness to pay is for a non-economist?
Oh, sure. I apologize. Well, it's really just exactly what it sounds like. It's how much are you willing to pay for that resource? And that is derived differently depending on the use that you're talking about, right? So for the domestic users, right, your farm or your ranch and you're pumping water for your home use, the estimate that we use there is given to us by EPA is 2.5% of median household income. In an irrigation sense, right, then that number would be driven by the value of your crops, right? So you take the value of your crops and you would net that from all of your other unrelated water expenses, fertilizer, labor, machinery, et cetera. And you would know, okay, well, based on the value of my crops on the market, here's how much I'm willing to pay if I'm willing to, depending on how much money I need to retain as profit. Right. So if the market price of your soybeans is $100 per what you produce per acre per year, and your costs unrelated to pumping are $25, you're left with $75. So that's your profit before you pay for your groundwater expenses. So what are you willing to pay in that sense? Well, are you willing to have an additional $25, right, of costs and take home 50 as profit? It varies from producer to producer, but that's kind of generally how that works.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Are there other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question, Justin.
Sure.
Really enjoyed your work. That's pretty cool, and nice to see the shout out to Scott DeSecco and Deborah Perron's paper. That's pretty exciting. So I actually have a follow-up to what you just mentioned. So that willingness to pay, there might be a big difference between a farmer who's making a profit out of that water versus somebody who's using that for drinking and flushing their toilet. Right. And I think you pegged it on household income, which means it's domestic use. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily industrial or agricultural or any other commercial use. Right. Or even it doesn't deal with economies of scale. If you've got, say, a community paying for one big well versus it's basically just mom and pop wells, right? So I
Right.
wonder how that would change, and how would that change your analysis really, and what's their implication?
Yeah, no, that's it. Honestly, that's an excellent question. So first and foremost, your willingness to pay changing by the use is huge. It's critical, and in fact, that's kind of the main focus of our first paper that we published with the Texas Water Journal. And we actually looked at different willingness to pay based on different crops. And what you see in that is exactly this. If you're an alfalfa farmer who's sort of on the lower end of the agricultural prices, then the yields that are feasible for you are much smaller than if you're a tomato farmer, right, who makes 5 times as much, right, for the same volume of water. And the same process applies to if you look at, say, a microchip manufacturer or something like that, which has a much higher willingness to pay. And that's exactly it, right? We can use these tools to quantify how groundwater recoverability changes for any use that we might be interested in our management area, right? The model takes in those inputs, you tell it what your willingness to pay is, and so you can kind of vary that based on literature estimates of certain uses, or if you're perhaps you're a GCD and you have hard and fast numbers from your constituents.
But I guess given that you show that it's one of the big constraints in one site that you showed, then what that means then is if Tesla starts putting in groundwater wells, we're kind of all screwed, right? Because they're willing to pay a lot. Or if people start growing cannabis in Texas,
Right.
so it could be quite a big change. But
It could, yeah.
But thanks for answering that. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And I need to send you up I guess not a paper, but a student of mine worked on the deepening of groundwater wells in Texas for the last century. And I've always wanted to multiply that by some economic cost to figure out how much more are we paying for a volume of water compared to 1900s. But really enjoyed your talk. I got to go. I actually have a meeting at 1 o'clock, but thank you.
Perfect. Understood. Thank you.
Are there other questions?
Justin, I presume you probably looked at this. First of all, a really great paper because this total available groundwater and storage is not probably as useful as we think it is. But a minor point, and I suspect it's insignificant, but in the models, do you look at the increase in recharge by cross-formational flow from surface water bodies? I mean, did you look at that? Was there any change in the numbers?
No, actually, we didn't look at that. And there's 2 main reasons for that. Number one, we're trying to kind of keep it comparable and parallel to the TERS estimate, right? To look at the same issues, really just looking at in situ storage per se. And then the other part of it is, if we remember, we're talking about our concern about deficits under the state water plan, which is obviously under drought of record conditions. So, if you're looking at drought of record conditions, recharges is negligible or none. There is some cross-formational flow, but it's interesting. The data that I get from the groundwater availability model seems to suggest that the cross-formational flow is fairly negligible. Actually, they have very distinct and disparate heads, and also the vertical hydraulic conductivity in all of these formations is very, very, very small.
Right, and I suspect for the Carrizo Wilcox, that's probably a pretty good assumption. Nice job.
Thank you.
How about some other questions? Maybe I'll just pick people in the little windows. No, I won't do that. I'm just kidding.
Question bingo. Well, we are running out of time too. I know other people have commitments, and I did my best, unlike some people, haha, joke, to stay within 1 o'clock. Really, thank you all for coming. It's always a pleasure to share our work. We're very excited about it.
Great. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I will hand it over to the hosts, to Evan and CJ. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, not much else to add. Thank you, Justin. That was wonderful. If you could fill out the PhD evaluation form in the chat, you can find it there. Please do so. Otherwise, have a great weekend.
All right. Thanks,
See you
everybody.
next week.
Have a great weekend. Hopefully we're not dodging hail today.
Yeah, it's coming our way.
Yeah.
Nice work, Justin.
Thank you, Daniela.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.
Great job, Justin.
Thank you, Jay.